President Trump called the whistleblower a spy and indicated he would like to interview that person personally. So it's worth taking a look at exactly what legal protections whistleblowers have. There is no one law that protects whistleblowers. There are many laws that create different shields for whistleblowers in the federal government. They provide protections for employees who want to give information to Congress in good faith. According to these laws, as long as a whistleblower follows proper protocol, they cannot be punished by their superiors as a reprisal. This includes getting fired or being demoted, as well as being given worse working conditions. For those in the intelligence community, the laws also provide protection against having their security clearances revoked. But it is worth noting that these protections were written when considering retaliation from a boss, not retaliation from the President of the United States. And for that matter, whistleblowers in the intelligence community are in a very unique spot. In a 1998 Congress situation, they passed the Intelligence Community Whistleblower Protection Act specifically to protect whistleblowers in the intelligence community. Intel whistleblowers have the same protections against retaliation, but there's a very specific catch. If an intelligence whistleblower is retaliated against, they cannot take their case to court due to concerns about classified material, meaning they are protected, but still more vulnerable than the average whistleblower. As for anonymity, the Inspector General Act says that the IG is prohibited from disclosing the identity of the whistleblower. IG Michael Atkinson has so far protected the whistleblower, and Acting DNI McGuire has testified that he does not know the whistleblower's identity. But the only person who legally cannot identify the whistleblower is Atkinson. If the president, for example, discovers the identity of the whistleblower and he wants to go public, it appears he can do so.
All right, joining us now is research fellow at the Cato Institute and former CIA analyst and a whistleblower himself, Patrick Eddington. Patrick, Stephanie's great explanation there leads me to an important question here. Whistleblowers typically are protected from reprisal. Here we've got an issue with identity. What Donald Trump seems to be wanting to do is have this whistleblower exposed and, by extension, some people say, targeted by supporters of the president.
Well, it's great to be with both of you. Thanks for having me on. Let me just say that I think I would take some issue with the idea that the law actually really serves as any kind of meaningful protection. You know, yesterday I hosted a panel at the Cato Institute in which I had my friend Irvin McCullough of the Government Accountability Project on stage to kind of talk about some of these very issues. And GAP handles whistleblowers essentially on a case-by-case basis, and they have a great casework team handling these kinds of things. And what you find more often than not is that mid-level and senior managers in government are usually willing to run the risk of retaliating against somebody, even though they know that, at least technically, it's illegal to do so. When I worked for Congressman Rush Holt between 2004 and 2014, we actually developed legislation that would have made it a felony for folks in the government to engage in that kind of behavior, that would have carried a mandatory minimum 10-year sentence and a $100,000 fine. Now, that would certainly be great if we had something like that today to help protect whistleblowers. But your larger issue here with respect to the president is correct. And here's the other vulnerability. I have no idea whether this person works for the CIA or not. That's been reported by the New York Times, but it's not been independently confirmed. But if that person does work for the CIA, the issue that you have here is that everybody who works at CIA is what's known as accepted service. And in a federal hiring and firing context, what that basically means is that you don't have the same kind of civil service protections that folks in other parts of the government often do. So if the president were to find out who this person was, he could actually fire them. And I think that's exactly, it should be at least a trigger for action as far as I'm concerned, if Mr. Schiff and the Speaker are actually serious about this. So I want to make it clear, this person is really in a deeply tenuous situation. And the president's overt attempts to intimidate this person are not just aimed at this person. They're aimed at anybody else in the federal government who is thinking about coming forward and potentially talking about waste, fraud, abuse, criminal conduct that's been conducted by this administration or its appointees. That's the concern I have.
Do you think the president's tactics work? You yourself are a whistleblower. You know what it's like. When he says the things he does, when he makes the threats, what do you actually think it does to people?
Well, you have to understand that folks like me who are very, very inner-directed, who have a specific code that we live by, At the end of the day, we don't give a rip what the President of the United States says because we didn't take an oath to the President of the United States. We took an oath to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. That being said, you know, the Ellsbergs of the world are rare. The Thomas Tams of the world are rare. The Edward Snowdens are rare. By the way, while I'm on that topic, all charges against Edward Snowden should be dismissed with prejudice and he should be allowed to come back to the United States. But back to our topic here. I do fear, without question, that if this president were to learn the identity of this individual and were to publicize that person's information, that person's physical safety would
right,
in fact
so this
be
is
at risk.
because I think that's an important point. A lot of whistleblower protections are about a person's job, about reprisal, about being punished, about having, you know, things like that. We're in a different category here.
We are. There's absolutely no question about it. And we've never had a circumstance in which any whistleblower in the government has actually pointed a finger directly at the President of the United States and made the allegations that we're hearing here. So, yeah, Mr. Trump's conduct is well beyond the pale, to say the least.
Hey, MSNBC fans, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down there and click on any of the videos here to watch the latest interviews and highlights. You can get more MSNBC for free every day with our newsletters. Just visit msnbc.com/newsletters to sign up now.